The structures of the urinary system function to filter blood and remove waste from the body. The kidneys are the blood-filtering organs. Blood enters the kidneys through the renal arteries. Within the kidneys, substances are filtered out of the blood into urinary structures. Some substances are then reabsorbed back into the blood, and others are secreted into the urine. This three-step process cleans blood and creates the waste product urine. Urine exits the kidneys and moves down the ureters to the bladder. As the bladder fills, interactions with the brain and nerves contract and relax muscular structures, and urine is pushed out through the urethra in a process called micturition.
Okay, so here we've got the dissected view of the kidneys here. So we've got the right kidney, left kidney. Above either kidney we have what we call the adrenal glands. And then there are a few structures missing here. So here's the diaphragm superior to that. And you're missing the stomach, the intestines, the liver, the spleen, all sorts of stuff. But what we do have present here is the inferior vena cava and the descending abdominal aorta. Off of this descending abdominal aorta, you will recognize the common iliacs down here at the distal portion of it. And then branching directly off of the descending abdominal aorta is the left renal artery and right renal artery. Now you can't quite see it because the inferior vena cava is in the way, but I want you to notice that the left renal artery is shorter than the right renal artery, and then vice versa for the veins. Now we've got the left renal vein, which is longer than the right renal vein, and that is because these kidneys sit posterior to them, and they're also sitting next to the spine. So here's the spinal column right there, and they're sitting against the posterior abdominal wall. So as we break down more structures here, we're going to have the right kidney here. You'll notice it also sits a little bit lower on the right-hand side than it does on the left, and that's because of the liver. So the liver, again, would be right above this, and so with that missing, you don't get appreciation for that, but that liver would be sitting right here below the diaphragm and causing that right kidney to be a little bit more inferior here. So as we collect and produce urine in the kidneys here, we're going to leave the kidney through this structure, which we call the renal pelvis. So the renal pelvis is sort of like a funnel. As the urine is collected and leaves the kidney, it comes down this funnel, and then it continues its path down towards the urinary bladder through a structure we call the ureter. So the ureter is found on both sides, dumping down into this structure down here in the pelvic bowl, and that is the urinary bladder itself. Now, below this urinary bladder, which we'll have to do some dissection, I'm going to click that, there is the prostate. So the prostate gland is going to be hanging down just below the bladder here and behind the pubic symphysis. So we've got the kidneys, the ureters, the urinary bladder, the prostate, and the urethra. So there's the urethra. Now this is a male, so if we were to switch this to a female, it would obviously look a little bit different, and we'll check that out here momentarily. But what I want you to appreciate in this view is that the urethra is traveling through the prostate. That will become important as we go on to the male reproductive system, and we will use some other glands to add secretions, and we use the same pathway there. This next slide is going to show us the female version of this. So now we've got exact same structures. We've got the kidneys there with the adrenal glands above that. All other structures being the same. We've got the ureters leading our way down to the urinary bladder. And now we can show the urethra on the female here. The urethra on a female is much, much, much shorter. And then you'll notice that instead of the penis, we've got the urethral orifice, and it is much, much shorter, and that's what makes females actually more prone to getting UTIs or urinary tract infections. The plumbing is just different, and so bacteria has an easier pathway to get into the urethra and up into the urinary bladder. So most of the times those urinary tract infections will start down here in the urethra, and they will travel up into the urinary bladder. Now that can be fairly serious, and what we really don't like is when they start to climb up the ureter and get into the kidneys themselves. That can be quite dangerous. All right, so we've got the urinary system's function, and the main function here is going to be elimination. They're going to be eliminating waste from the body. The other thing that they function in is blood pressure regulation. So they're going to be controlling how much blood how much blood volume we contain. So if we've got too much blood, if our blood pressure is too high, they're going to eliminate some water. And if the opposite is true, say our blood pressure is too low, then they're going to hold on and you won't produce as much urine. All right, so we talked a little bit about this. The posterior abdominal wall is where these kidneys are going to hang out. They lie down here between T12 and L3. So here's T12 right there. And then if we turn this, that's T1, 2, and 3. So we're going to be between these two structures, T12 and L3. They also lie posterior to a structure we call the peritoneum. The peritoneum is a serous membrane, so if we were referencing the heart, we would be talking about pericardium. If we were talking about the lungs, we'd be talking about the pleura. And in the abdominal cavity, we call it peritoneum. And why this is important is because everything behind the peritoneum manifests different symptoms than things that are found within the peritoneum. So everything behind the peritoneum, we would call that term, you can see it up in the paragraph there, retroperitoneal. And so retroperitoneal organs, they will refer to back pain. And so, especially in my field, that's very important because we have to eliminate these things. So the kidneys could be the problem. You could have a urinary tract infection that has climbed up the ureters and into the kidneys, and now all of a sudden you've got back pain. And you think it's just a sore muscle, but in fact, your kidneys are at risk for kidney disease that could go as far as leading to dialysis. Other things that are retroperitoneal we'll talk about in the digestive tract, but the part of the large intestine and the pancreas, several other things, the uterus, all that fun stuff. So it can be back pain as it shows up. And now here's our first glimpse of the liver. So you'll notice that they're right below the liver. This is the anterior view. Here's our posterior view. And so the liver is going to be found on the right. And again, we're looking at them from the behind. And you'll notice, especially from this view, that right kidney lies a little bit more inferior than the left one. And that, again, is directly because of that liver being in the way. Here's the inside of a kidney. This is a fantastic view, better than anything we would get in the lab doing a dissection, so you're not missing out on much here. When we look at the kidney, there's three basic regions that we're going to look at here. We're going to look at the renal cortex, which is going to be the outside. So there's your renal cortex. The next layer we look at is the pyramids. And then we look at the renal pelvises, which we saw earlier as the funnel, the pathway into the ureter. So basically what we've got going on here is all of the blood vessels are going to travel into the kidney and go out to this outer cortex, to this renal cortex. They're then going to go through a thing called the glomerulus, which we'll learn about here shortly, and that's where we get into the pyramids. The pyramids are where we do all of the elimination of all of the waste as well as reabsorption of things we want to hold on to. From there, at the very tip of those pyramids, you'll notice that they insert into an even smaller funnel, and that is going to be the beginning of the renal pelvis. Here is a cross-cut slide of a kidney. So this is the histology. This is a very good slide. You can see the cortex and what we would call the medulla. Now medulla, again, just means middle, so you've seen that word before, don't be confused, but now we're looking at the middle of a kidney, or the medulla of the kidney. Out in the cortex, again, that's where all of the blood is going to be fed to. We're going to go out into the cortex. Then the medulla, if I go back one, the medulla is going to be the region in between the pyramids. And it won't let me highlight it on this, it just highlights the entire thing. But it's going to be the region in between each of those pyramids. And I'll be able to highlight that here for you in just a little bit. Scroll that text so you can read that. I'm not going to read that for you, but feel free to check that out. I'm going to scroll pictures. So now we've zoomed in a little bit more, and there's some important structures that we find here in the kidney. The very first one we come in contact with is the structure that you see at the top, and that's the renal corpuscle. Now that is where the blood turns into capillaries, and we've got an afferent capillary, and then we go into the renal corpuscle, and then we have an efferent capillary. Now the afferent is blood that has not been filtered yet, so that's blood leaving the aorta. And then we go through the afferent arteriole and into the renal corpuscle. Then, after we've gone through the renal corpuscle, through that capillary bed, we go through the efferent arteriole, and then we're heading back to the inferior vena cava via the renal vein. Now, once we get into the renal corpuscle, that's where our filtration and elimination of waste takes place. And so we've got some other structures that you see labeled on this picture: the distal convoluted tubule, the renal tubule, the proximal convoluted tubule. So what we have here, we're going to start with the proximal. The proximal tubule is a structure that is right on the other side of the renal corpuscle, and I'll have a picture that shows you this. I kind of wish that this was in a different order, but we'll maybe come back to this. So the renal corpuscle, that's where our blood's coming in, and it's going to be filtered. The very first tube, so to speak, that it's going to go through is that proximal convoluted tubule. Now, a lot of times we'll abbreviate that as the PCT. From there, we go through a thing called the loop of Henle, which we don't have visible on this particular slide. Sometimes it's called the loop of Henle. Other times we call it the nephron loop. They're the same thing. From the nephron loop, we go into that structure that you see there called the distal convoluted tubule. Now this is all filtering. From that distal convoluted tubule, we're going to then go into a structure called the collecting duct. Now to demonstrate this, I think it would be best if I drew this. So we're going to draw, this is the renal corpuscle. All right, so we're going to have an inner and outer membrane. And now this is the proximal convoluted tubule. So this is my best drawing of a convoluted tubule. Just pretend that that has lumen the whole way through and that I didn't do a terrible job drawing that. Then we're going to go ahead and go down into the nephron loop. And so we'll take a look at that here. And the nephron loop is going to travel down, and it's going to be thin like this, and then it's going to come back up. So pretend this is the same diameter all the way up into this point. Then we get thicker, and we go back up like this, and then we go over here, and we go to another little convoluted tubule. We'll see if I can draw that okay. And then we dump into a structure over here that we're going to call the collecting duct. Now I'm going to add a couple more tubes dumping into this because there would be many. So of this structure here, all of this bit right here, we would then have another one here, another one here. You could add one over here. Basically, you're going to have many of those going into this, and this is the collecting duct. This is the proximal convoluted tubule. This is the loop of Henle, and this is the distal convoluted tubule. Over here, we're going to have blood supply coming in. We're going to call this, and I'm just going to do squiggly lines, and then it leaves. Diameter again would be the same. The thing that changes is the content. So we're going to call this the afferent arteriole, and this is the efferent arteriole. So we've got an arrow going this way into the glomerulus. So this is the glomerulus. Now that blood inside of here, that's going to go into this space based on the blood pressure, based on the pressure within this system out here. Now once all the filtrates, the ions and all of that stuff is into here, what's left, the filtered blood, so to speak, is going to go through the afferent, and we're going to continue on, and we'll actually go into some structures, the paratubular capillaries, and we'll talk about that in a little while. But those paratubular capillaries, if you imagine, they come over here, and they're going to just circle around this, and then head back to the renal vein, and it's a little bit more involved than that, but we'll learn that in a little bit. So here's renal artery, and that's leading into the afferent arteriole. Then we go in, we've got this capillary bed inside of the glomerulus, we leave through the afferent arteriole, and then we go and again we wrap around these structures over here. Now why do we do that? That is because we dump everything. We dump almost everything we have in the blood goes into that proximal convoluted tubule, but somewhere around, I don't know what the exact number is, but it's probably about 95%. 95% of that stuff is going to end up back in the blood supply by leaving and going into the interstitial fluid. So we could call this the interstitial space. And from the interstitial space, we're going to go back into these paratubular capillaries, where we head to the renal vein and back into the circulatory system. Now let's go back here to our diagram. So there's your renal corpuscle. I hope this picture makes a little bit more sense now. And now you can see the actual structures within the histology slide. And then this is showing the exact same thing, just a little bit more zoomed in, I think. Yeah, a little bit more zoomed in. So there's the collecting duct up top. Again, that's where all of these are dumping into. So there's one collecting duct for many of those glomerulus with the proximal convoluted tubule, the nephron loop, and the distal convoluted tubule dumping into it. So this is showing the loop of Henle. You can see that LOH, so it's showing you the loop of Henle. You can see how thin, I think this is a very important thing to see here, how thin that epithelial tissue is on that loop of Henle. So when we got to the distal convoluted tubule, you can see that that's a cuboidal cell. Same thing with the collecting duct. Same thing with a lot of this, because the fluid and the ions and all of that other stuff, it's not going to be able to travel through very well. But in that loop of Henle is super thin, and that makes sense, because if you come back to this diagram here, where we've got those paratubular capillaries, again, we're reabsorbing. So we want that thin section of loop of Henle. So that thin section is this section right here. There's your thin section of loop of Henle. That has got a super thin membrane, and that's going to allow for simple diffusion to take place very readily. So there's your thin segment loop of Henle. All right, so now we're going to get more involved with the blood supply of the kidney. So we've got to take the blood from the descending abdominal aorta to the right and left renal arteries. Here's your kidneys right there. We've got the renal arteries. Now you can notice those renal arteries, they go up and around these structures. So I'm going to highlight some structures we've talked about. There's the kidney, there's the pyramids. Now you'll notice that the renal arteries, they go out and around those pyramids. This is all part of getting the blood filtered. On the way back, you'll notice the renal veins, they do the exact same thing. They run in the exact same pathway, and for the most part, they have the exact same names. Here is that picture, only done well. So this is what I was trying to draw for you when I was using the tablet. So we've got the renal artery coming in. Right away we start branching. So we turn from the renal artery into the segmental arteries. Those segmental arteries are going to do just that. They're going to go to different segments of the kidney. From there, we turn into interlobar arteries. Now, those interlobar arteries are going to go in between the pyramids, and they head up and they become arcuate arteries. Those arcuate arteries wrap around the outer portion of those pyramids. From there, we have a thing that we call the cortical radiate arteries. And let's see if they've got that labeled on here. They've got it labeled as interlobular, which is different than interlobar. So interlobar is between the two pyramids, and they unfortunately are only labeling an interlobular vein. But again, the name would be the same. So that interlobular vein would be the same as an interlobular artery. And so their interlobular artery is part of the diagram that goes off to the right. So we've got the interlobular artery. Now you can see there's my afferent arteriole and my efferent arteriole, my glomerulus, my capillaries. All of this is filtering that product. You can see the everything's wrapping around there, so it's going to allow all that filtrate to pass out of the blood supply, in through the glomerulus, out to the proximal convoluted tubule, out to the loop of Henle or the nephron loop, then to the distal convoluted tubule, and into the collecting duct. That collecting duct is then going to travel down towards the renal pelvis through the renal pyramid. There is almost the exact picture I tried to draw. So you can see that there's different portions to this, and they've done a very good job of demonstrating what this looks like within the pyramid and the renal cortex. So you've got the renal cortex. Again, that's where the blood travels to. It goes out there, then you've got the interlobular artery. That interlobular artery then gives off the afferent arteriole. The afferent arteriole goes into the glomerular capsule of the glomerulus. That's where we then filter out all that product, and then it's inside of the proximal convoluted tubule. From there, we go down the nephron loop. We go into the distal convoluted tubule and into the collecting duct, which will travel down to the minor calyx, major calyx, renal pelvis, ureter, urinary bladder, out to the urethra, where it's expelled into the toilet. Here's a close-up view of the glomerulus. So here's the glomerulus. You can see that there's the arteriole, and on the left-hand side of this glomerulus, you can see that that blood is heading inside, and it is going into the middle of the glomerulus there, where we've got two different membranes. So we've got one that is going to be the glomerular capsule. Now that's a regular epithelial tissue. The other one is, and that's the outer membrane. So if I was to draw a backwards C around this glomerulus, that would be the glomerular capsule. Then you have the glomerular space or the capsular space, and inside of that you have some podocytes. Those podocytes are wrapped around the vessels themselves. So it's not a distinct wall that you can see like you can on the glomerular capsule. Instead, you see podocytes mixed in and around these blood vessels, these capillaries. So that is one barrier. So basically what the point here is that you've got blood inside of this arteriole into the capillary, and it's got four membranes that it needs to pass through. So it's going to pass through the blood vessel wall, so simple squamous. Then it's got to go through a basement membrane. Before it does that, it's got to go through, it's got to go from the arteriole through the simple squamous, through the podocyte. Then it's got to get into the capsular space, and it's got to go through the simple squamous cell, and the basement membrane. Here's showing that at a closer view. So you've got your squamous cells, your capsule. Then on the inside, you've got your podocytes. Again, those podocytes are wrapped around the capillaries themselves. So again, two barriers that they've got to cross. The entirety of this we would call the glomerulus, and you can see the capillaries there. Now we've got some cuboidal cells. So these are the tubules. This one doesn't show it very well, but you can, in fact, if we had microscopes, we'd be able to do this. And if I wasn't kicked out of the building, I would have taken pictures. But we have different colored nuclei when we're looking at the proximal convoluted tubule versus the distal convoluted tubule. So the distal convoluted tubule, the D for dark, if you were to look at the nuclei on the distal convoluted tubule, under a typical histology slide, the nuclei would stand out and they'd be very, very defined because they're very dark. Whereas the proximal, the nuclei are going to be light. The other thing we look for, and I don't see it on this slide, but on the inside of the proximal convoluted tubule, we have microvilli. So again, increasing that surface area, allowing us to reabsorb 95% of the product that we sent into the tubule in the first place. The distal convoluted tubule, we don't have to worry about that. We've already done most of the reabsorption. At that point, we're just changing things based on the body conditions, on our hydration level, our blood pressure, and all of those types of things. So the amount of exchange that's occurring later on in the nephron is very minimal compared to when we first get in at the proximal convoluted tubule. Here's our filtration. So we've got that renal artery, and we're going to show the renal pyramids. So the things that it filters: water, solutes enter the filtrate, white blood cells and proteins remain in the bloodstream. So that's important to keep in mind. All of these things that are crossing into and being filtered by the nephrons in the cortex and the top of the pyramids here, that will not include blood cells. The only time we have that is if those membranes have broken down. So when we look into the glomerulus, the beginning part of that nephron, if those are damaged, and damaged to the point where that membrane is compromised, then and only then would we expect to find blood in urine. And so that's a pathological state. So that's something we check for in a urinalysis, is we're looking for that blood to be in there. That could be simply from a urinary tract infection that, like I said, climbed up the urethra, climbed up into the bladder, climbed up the ureters, and then that bacteria got into the kidneys and started degrading the epithelium within there. Here's a video. We'll take a look on that filtration process.
Each kidney includes over 1 million blood-filtering units called nephrons. Blood enters the nephron through a capillary bed called a glomerulus. It is surrounded by a cup-like structure, the glomerular capsule, which is the beginning of the duct called the renal tubule. As blood flows through the glomerulus, blood pressure forces it against a specialized layer of cells that surrounds the capillaries. The layer of cells blocks blood cells and proteins, but lets waste and water pass through the glomerulus and into the glomerular capsule. The filtrate then flows into the proximal convoluted tubule. This process is called glomerular filtration. It is the first step in urine formation.
So again, here's that same picture. I think I've drawn and talked about this enough, but they show the blood flow going into the glomerulus, which is those specialized capillaries. From there, we filter things out, just not blood, only things that are small enough to get through: water, ions, other things like that. Now, these do filter a crazy, crazy amount. And so the amount of filtrate, as you can see there, produced each minute is 125 milliliters. Now, I don't have a good analogy of what that would be, but let's see if Google has something. So 125 mil, let's see what that looks like. If Google has any pictures of that, it looks like we're going to be about a large bottle of cologne or perfume. So it's doing that every minute. Reabsorption and secretion. So again, the whole point of this is that we want to recycle.
Glomerular filtration produces a plasma-like filtrate containing waste, but also water and other substances the body needs. As the filtrate passes out of the glomerular capsule and through the renal tubule, substances like water, essential ions, glucose, amino acids, and proteins are reabsorbed into the body through cells along the tube wall. At the same time, additional waste ions and hydrogen ions still in the blood pass from capillaries into the renal tubule. This process is called secretion. This process of reabsorbing water and nutrients and secreting additional waste creates urine. The urine passes out of the kidney through the renal pelvis and ureters and into the bladder.
So back to those renal pyramids. Again, at the outer portion of this, you're going to find the nephron. Then we're going to have all of that taking place, all that secretion, filtration taking place, and they head down into the renal pelvis. You'll notice that renal pelvis has many holes in it, and we'll name those coming up. Here is the typical content or makeup of urine. So most of this, if you'll notice, is water. 95% of this is going to be water. Then we're going to have a little bit of waste. So 5% waste products, and then if we break those waste products in, we're going to have nitrogenous waste, we're going to have creatinine, ammonia, uric acids. All of those are only going to make up that 5%. So the creatinine, ammonia, uric acid, only 0.2%. The dissolved salts and other ions, 2.8%, and the urea at 2% there. You'll also have some other things that leave the body, and again, those are things we would typically hang on to, but you can have sodium, potassium, hydrogen, and calcium all end up in that urine. Now we're going to talk a little bit about function, so a little physiology here. We've got a hormone called ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic. So basically what the function of this is to retain fluid. So when we have a need to reabsorb water, then we will stimulate the pituitary gland to release more ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. This tells the kidneys to close things down. So basically, don't let anything get into the renal pelvis and ureter. We need to hold on to it. So there's your kidneys, your hypothalamus, if you remember from last semester, and then right below the hypothalamus there, we've got the pituitary gland. So that hypothalamus is going to be detecting, and then it's going to tell the pituitary gland to release the ADH, the antidiuretic hormone. That antidiuretic hormone will enter the bloodstream, head down to the kidneys, and then say, hold on, folks, we need to retain some fluid. Our blood pressure is low, whatever it might be, but if we're dehydrated, we will release ADH, and that will allow us to retain more fluid. Now we're going to look at the pathway of urine, so we're going to get a little bit more in depth here. There's your renal pyramids. Those are going to dump into the renal pelvis, which will dump into the ureters, the urinary bladder, and then the urethra. So something we've seen already. Now the ureters are composed of smooth muscles, so that means involuntary control. And they do a thing called peristalsis, and peristalsis is similar to how a snake moves. It's rhythmic, and it moves from one end to the next, and it basically is like milking the fluid inside of it and getting it to go from superior to inferior. Here's the histology slide of the ureter. The inside of the ureter is going to be made up of an epithelium that you should be familiar with, and that is called transitional epithelium. So we'll have a layer of connective tissue, the adventitia on the outside, the muscularis just inside of that. So you basically have two layers of muscles here, and that's going to allow that peristalsis to take place. So in the first part, you're going to have an inner longitudinal layer of smooth muscle with an outer circular layer. And then when you get to the distal third, you're going to add in a third outer layer of longitudinal muscle. Here's a picture showing you the adventitia, So we've got the outer circular layer and the inner longitudinal layer. So this is going to be the first 2/3 of the ureter, not the distal third, where we would add that outer longitudinal layer. So we're going to have the circular layer on the outside, longitudinal layer of muscle, or the longitudinal muscularis layer if you're reading these tags, on the inside. And then inside of that, we have the transitional epithelium facing the lumen there. So that's where the urine would be traveling through. And that transitional epithelium, again, would change shape depending on how much fluid was passing through the structure. Now here is a female, half a pelvis. We've got few things removed here. So we're going to look at where things are in position. So here's the pubic symphysis. This would be anterior. So there's anterior. You can see the vestibule, bladder. This is the uterus right here. So we've got the urinary bladder. Let's see if it cuts anything away when we touch this. We've got the vagina. Posterior to that, the uterus up above that. So uterus, vagina, bladder, urethra, all from anterior to posterior. We'd go pubic symphysis, urinary bladder, vagina, and then your rectum. Here is a male pelvis, similar structures, but now we're going to have different reproductive parts. So there's the urinary bladder there. You can see a couple of glands and vesicles here. You can see the prostate gland. There's your rectum posteriorly. And again, your prostate gland, let's see if that does a cutaway. It just leaves it like that. So you've got your pubic symphysis, urinary bladder, prostate, and rectum. Now we're going to talk a little bit about bladder anatomy. The bladder has a muscle inside of it, and this muscle is what allows it to expel the contents. There's also going to be some other structure. So there's like a funnel in it basically, and we call that funnel region the trigone. And so that trigone is right there, and just above it you can see the ureteral orifice. And so that is the part of the urinary bladder where this ureter is making its entrance. So we've got the ureter right there, and then we've got the ureteral orifice. We've got one of those on each side, and then here's the trigone. So then inside of the wall of the bladder, we've got a muscle called the detrusor muscle. This is smooth muscle, and so again, this is not under our control. Here's your bladder. Bladder histology. It's going to have the exact same epithelium as the ureter. So the ureter and the bladder are the only two places we find that transitional epithelium. Most of it's going to be the exact same. You're going to have the lumen, then you're going to have your transitional epithelium, your lamina propria with some connective tissue in there. You know, that lamina propria, in addition to the transitional epithelium, we call the mucosa layer. And then in that mucosal layer, we'll have mucosal folds. Now, if we go a little bit further into the tissue, we have the muscularis layer, and then we'll go and look at, oops, too far, this layer right here. So you can see that transitional epithelium. Now, this is a good side-by-side. It's showing you an empty bladder, so those transitional epithelium are nice and fluffy. Nuclei are nice and round and in the middle, and then on the right, they're flat and almost have a squamous-like appearance. And the nuclei are a little bit more squished. So we would call the one on the right distended. So if you have a full bladder, you have a distended bladder. There again is that detrusor muscle. So when the bladder fills with urine, those stretch receptors in the bladder wall are going to trigger a thing we call the micturition reflex. And so that micturition reflex then is involuntary, and it says, hey, internal sphincter, it's time to go to the bathroom. And so there's an internal sphincter right there, but that's not the only roadblock in the way. We also have an external sphincter. So the external sphincter right there, and this is a female anatomy, it looks like. So the external and internal are both found in male and female, but the external sphincter is skeletal muscle. So this one is voluntary control. So when you get the initial urge to go to the bathroom, it's because of those stretch receptors in the bladder wall. Then you get this micturition reflex, and it says, hey, let's go to the bathroom. And now the show's all yours. The external urethral sphincter is going to be the one that you would use to control for that voluntary relaxation, and then that would result in urination. For the nervous system here, if you've heard of a thing called cauda equina syndrome, then good for you. If not, then look it up sometime. But that's something that doctors are very worried about when somebody loses their bowel and bladder function. These are all sacral spinal nerves. So these can be affected when you have low back trauma, low back injury, some type of a basically breakdown of something down here. And that can then, you can see the sacral spinal nerves exiting there. Those openings can be compromised, say from a herniated disc or a broken pelvis, something you don't want, but very tragic. But it doesn't always lead to this, but you can definitely have a loss of function of the urinary bladder, and you can see that it also goes down, and these sacral nerves form part of the sciatic nerve. So there's your spinal cord, thalamus, cerebral cortex. So these sacrospinal nerves are the sensory, and they're going to stimulate that micturition reflex, which is then going to tell the thalamus, the coordination center, as well as the cerebral cortex, that it's time to go to the bathroom, time for urination to take place, and so then that's when the external sphincter takes over. So again, that internal sphincter, this is going to show you a cutaway. So now we've got the urinary bladder cutaway, that internal sphincter being under voluntary control. So we've got those sacral spinal nerves sending a message up to the thalamus and to the cerebral cortex, and that cerebral cortex allows you to take over and use your voluntary muscles, your skeletal muscles, and then from there we're going to be able to expel the urine for urination. So that is how we stay continent. We don't want to have incontinence. There's the female urethra. So the female urethra is a little bit more simple than the male, so we'll start there. The female urethra has just one part. We just call it urethra. Before we get to the urethra, when we're leaving the urinary bladder, we have what we call the bladder neck. After the urethra, distal, we have the external urethral orifice, and that is found within the vestibule of the female. Now on the male, we have three different parts. So we still have urethra, and if you remember from early on in the lecture, we were talking about the differences in urinary tract infection likeliness, and so the male makes it a little bit tougher because the plumbing is just longer. So here's your prostatic urethra. So there's the neck, let's see here, bladder neck right there. Then this we're going to call the prostatic urethra, and that prostatic urethra passes through what? The prostate. From there we go into a structure that we call the membranous urethra, the shortest part of the urethra, and that is going through this little structure called the external urethral sphincter. So the external urethral sphincter and the spongy urethra, or excuse me, the membranous urethra are found in the exact same place. Then we get into the penile tissue, the erectile tissue, and from there out we have the spongy urethra, which takes us all the way out to the external urethral orifice in the glands of the penis. So there's your bladder neck, prostate, and again there's the penis there. So as we're leaving, I'm going to go in a reverse order of how they have it listed there. We'd be leaving the urinary bladder through the neck. We're going to enter through the urethra in the prostate, called the prostatic urethra. Then we travel through the external urethral sphincter, which is going to be called the membranous urethra. From there, we enter into the penis, where we are traveling through the spongy urethra, and then we make our way out to the external urethral orifice.